sound very interesting. Cute.
Yeah,
What did you have for lunch?
I had a hot dog. That's all I got left. I gotta go get some more.
Do you want a broth? Would you rather a broth or the soup?
Soup. Soup was great. I need to get a rug cleaner.
We just need to clean it up, but let me see. That's one. So aren't you talking now?
Yep.
How come you're not?
They had to restart everything.
Listen, I have
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Martín Evia, soy el decano de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad Torcuato Di Itela. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a este quinto encuentro del Seminario de Derecho, Economía y Regulación. Como nuestro invitado habla en inglés, vamos a pasar al inglés ahora. I'm going to switch to English. Welcome to the fifth workshop of the Law, Economics and Regulation workshop here at Torcuato Di Itela Law School. We are holding a series of workshops in the occasion of the 25th anniversary of our law school. And we are delighted, and it is a pleasure and an honor to have today Professor Tom Ulen. Tom is a research professor and Swanland Chair Emeritus at the College of Law at Illinois. He's a very old friend of our law school. He has helped us a lot with the Law and Economics program. He has been a visiting professor with us for many, many years. And so we are truly honored, Tom, to have you once again with us. We have faculty and students in the audience. Many of them have been your students in our classes. So we are truly delighted to have you. As we usually go, Tom will present, and then we open up for questions from the audience. So Tom, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. And we are really, really honored to have you with us again. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Martine. I'm going to start my PowerPoint, and I hope that all will go well. There we go. I hope you can see that. I want to begin by thanking Martine for inviting me to speak to you today. I also want to say that when Martine says that I'm a very old friend of Di Itela, he means both that I have known Di Itela, I think, since its beginning, but that I'm also a very old person. He didn't put it that way, but I wanted to clarify that. As I hope you all know, I love Di Itela. It's a wonderful organization. I didn't realize that this was the 25th birthday, but it's a wonderful thing to know. I think of this law faculty as the best law faculty south of the equator, and certainly could stand comparison with the very best law faculties in the United States of America. I want to make two other preliminary comments. First, I want to thank all of you for listening to me today. I think my talk will be about 35 minutes. I'll try to hurry through so we can get to questions. If you have a question, please feel free to ask me a question anytime, but we will have an extensive period afterwards in which to ask questions. Second thing I want to say is that I'm going to use the tools of law and economics to look at the coronavirus pandemic. And I'm going to focus on the United States. But I hope that you'll recognize issues in Argentina that mirror those that you're facing in Argentina, and that what I have to say will be of some use, will be of some use to you. Here's an introduction and an outline of what I intend to talk about. I'm going to give you some background on the pandemic. I'm then going to talk about the economic costs of the pandemic, and then I'll focus on two different kinds of policy responses. One is the public health policy responses. The second is the economic policy responses. And then I'm going to turn to the topic of looking at some law and economic analyses of several legal issues that have been raised by the coronavirus pandemic. And then I'll have a very brief conclusion at the end. So here we go with some preliminary background. I think it's fair to say that the coronavirus is, the pandemic is one of the defining events of our times. This is the sort of historic episode that people will be talking about 100 years from now. Without any doubt, this is the worst public health event in the last 100 years. I checked the figures. For the world, as of yesterday, 27.5 million people have been infected with COVID-19. There have been almost 900,000 deaths around the world. For the United States, as of yesterday, there have been 6.5 million infections. That's the most of any country in the world, and almost 195,000 deaths, which is also the greatest number of deaths in the world. Not the greatest number per capita, but it's the greatest total number. As of yesterday for Argentina, there had been about 490,000 infections, the 10th most in the world, and slightly more than 10,000 deaths have been reported as due to the coronavirus in Argentina. Another thing I want to raise as a disclaimer is that, as you well know, things are changing very, very quickly in our understanding of the coronavirus pandemic. For example, in the month of March, when all of this began, we were told it was unnecessary to wear masks. Now we consider wearing masks, face masks, to be one of our most important public health protections. And just the other day, we received an official confirmation from Hong Kong that having COVID-19 once does not give you immunity to the disease. That is, you can get it multiple times. That's, if that turns out to be correct, that makes the business of creating a vaccine very, very troubling. We don't know that the vaccine is going to give us long-term immunity or just for a couple of months. If you'd like to know more than I've said about the background of the coronavirus, I'd very highly recommended a series of now 20 podcasts that have been done at the Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago called Pandemic Economics, and also some lectures that have been done at the Bendheim, I misspelled that, the Bendheim Center for Finance at Princeton University. Both of those they've been marvelous resources for me. Okay, I'm going to say some other things, and if you know this, forgive me for saying this. The novel coronavirus first appeared in Wuhan in the People's Republic of China in December 2019. Now, why is it novel and why coronavirus? First of all, you must recognize there are many other coronaviruses. For example, the virus that causes the common cold is a coronavirus. This particular coronavirus had never been seen before. It is called a coronavirus because it has crowns or coronae that stick up from its surface. Those projections make it easier for these viruses to seize onto the surface of a human cell. After seizing onto the surface of a cell, the coronavirus then inserts its genetic material into the human cell and uses the human cell to reproduce itself. Viruses, there's an estimate there are 10 to the 31, that's 10 followed by 31 zeros, 10 to the 31 viruses on Earth. And they have some sort of status between being alive and not being alive. One thing we do know about them is they cannot reproduce or stay in a suspended state of activity unless they find a host. And as it turns out, for the novel coronavirus, our respiratory tracts in particular are very, very fertile places for the coronavirus. Formally, the novel coronavirus is called SARS-CoV-2, which stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. And the disease we get from that coronavirus is called COVID-19. One last thing about the coronavirus, it's extremely small. The typical coronavirus, one virus is about 1/100th the size of an average bacterium, or 1/1000th the size of a cancer cell. That's why these viruses can spread so easily through sneezing and talking. In the United States, the very first super spreading event where one person infected lots of people occurred at a church choir practice near Seattle, Washington. One person had the virus, and by singing and expelling with his vocal cords the virus into the air, almost 50 people in the chorus were infected, and some of them died. You know that on March 11th, the World Health Organization declared this disease a pandemic, and that this has been the deadliest pandemic in 100 years. If one gets the disease, the likelihood of dying is about 4%. That's going down a little bit for reasons I'll be happy to tell you about. And that likelihood of death once you've contracted the disease is about 4 times higher than the likelihood of dying from seasonal influenza. Another thing to bear in mind as we talk about this is other recent diseases have not been nearly as deadly or widespread as COVID-19. During the initial SARS outbreak, remember SARS means severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS-CoV-1 in 2003, a total of 8,000 people were infected worldwide and 774 people died. Terrible tragedy, but compare that to what I told you about the size of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. Another deadly epidemic, the Ebola outbreak of 2014, 2016, there were 28,000 cases and 11,300 deaths. Notice, by the way, that the likelihood of dying if you got the Ebola virus was much higher than for COVID-19, but it was confined largely to West Africa. There were only 36 cases and 15 deaths in the entire rest of the world. The only thing that compares with the current pandemic is the Spanish influenza pandemic of 100 years ago. Here's a footnote. The Spanish influenza should not be called the Spanish influenza. It originated in Kansas in the United States, but for some reason it's called the Spanish flu, in the same way that our president calls this the Chinese virus. The Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918-1919 affected 1/3 of the population of the world, 500 million people, and 50 million people died, including 675,000 in the United States. Okay, I want to turn to the economic costs of the pandemic. Because the principal way that we have of dealing with the pandemic is a lockdown or stay-at-home policy. And why are those the principal ways? Because we do not have a treatment that works and we don't have a vaccine that works. Because the only viable health policy is to stop everything, stop people coming together and have them stay at home, the economic costs are immense. In the United States, 40 million adults, that's 1/3 almost of the labor force of 150 million, filed for unemployment benefits in the period between March and July. That's the highest level of unemployment since the Great Depression of 1929-33. The gross domestic product of the United States fell by 9.5% in the second quarter of 2020. On an annual basis, if that continues, and it's unlikely to continue, but if it would, that would be a 32.9% drop in the gross domestic product for 2020. The drop in the second quarter of 9.5% wiped out 5 years of growth. So it may be 5 to 10 years before we even get back to where we were in January of 2020. Some more about the economic costs. Other economies, with the exception of China, other economies are doing very, very badly too. The United Kingdom gross domestic product is expected to drop 11.5% this year. Germany, which is not having nearly as many deaths as we are, Germany's second quarter drop was even larger than the United States, 9.5%. China initially had a 2.6% drop in the period from December to February, but they have reported that for the second quarter of 2020, the People's Republic reported a 3.2% increase in GDP over the second quarter of last year, 2019. I think we need to recognize two things about the Chinese figures. First of all, they may not be accurate. But secondly, China, because of its political structure, can impose a lockdown much more effectively than can the many democratic countries. Okay, I want to turn to the policy responses to the pandemic. There are two kinds of policy responses, one addressing public health and one addressing the economic consequences of the lockdown and stay-at-home policies. The current administration, which I should advertise that I do not like at all, the current administration apparently believes that the public health response and the economic response are substitutes. You can do one or the other, but not both. In fact, if you try to understand what they've done, apparently they believe that people won't pay attention to the public health responses, but they will pay attention to economic responses. So they focused on trying to get the economy going again. I am persuaded by what Austin Goolsbee is an economist at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago, and was the chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. Austin Goolsbee calls the first rule of virus economics: the best way to get control the economy, to fix the economy, is to get control of the virus. His point is, I think, unassailable. It's absolutely right that if people thought that there was that the virus was not going to infect them, either because a treatment or a vaccine had been found, they would go about their daily business. They'd shop, they'd go to work, they do all the things that they're not doing now because of their fear of the virus. With regard to public health policy, I have to point out to you that in the United States, there's a complication with doing public health policy, and that is that there are three different levels of government that have to coordinate during a public health emergency. The national or federal government, the 50 state governments plus the District of Columbia, and local governments, cities, counties, and regions, and trying to get them all moving in the same direction is something like trying to herd cats. The federal government gave up very early trying to have a coherent national policy to address the coronavirus. And I think it's fair to characterize the public health policy from the federal government as having been weak, contradictory, and politically motivated. It has not been dictated by science. President Trump appointed a coronavirus task force that was led by two extraordinarily competent epidemiologists, one of whom, his name is Anthony Fauci, is a beloved character in the United States. And the president has been jealous of his high TV ratings and therefore has forbidden him to appear on the national news. The president can do that because Fauci is a federal government employee and has to follow the president's directions. The president has also been a source of misinformation for 6 months. In February, he said there are only 15 people with the disease and soon there will be none. It's like a miracle. Someday it will just disappear. A recent study by some economists and epidemiologists at Columbia University demonstrated that if the president had not said these terrible things that encourage people not to take the coronavirus seriously, at least 50,000 lives would have been saved. Nonetheless, the president declared a national emergency on March 13th, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC as it is called, issued guidelines in early March about how we should behave. The president promptly disavowed those guidelines and said not to pay attention to them. Insofar as there was going to be a serious public health policy response, that was left to the states and localities. But there was very little coordination among the states, although some states in different regions entered into what are called interstate compacts, which have to be approved by Congress, to coordinate their coronavirus pandemic responses. And those have been very useful. Some states, notably New York and New Jersey, imposed lockdowns and got control of the spread of the disease. Those two states, New York and New Jersey, have been models about how to get the number of coronavirus infections to decline. Other states, principally those in the southern part of the United States, who rely upon tourism a great deal, didn't do very much. And as a result, they're now having as many as 10 or 20,000 new cases per day. We cannot, because of our constitutional structure, impose restrictions on interstate movement. So the disease spread with travel. By contrast to the public health response, which was chaotic and ineffective, the economic response was marvelous. Congress and the Federal Reserve System behaved marvelously. I don't think there's any other word. Congress passed 4 major bills, including the CARES Act. CARES, C-A-R-E-S, stands for Coronavirus Aid, Relief and Economic Security Act. That included, for example, a program called the Paycheck Protection Program. The government, upon application by private businesses, would loan them up to $1 million for making payments to their employees to keep those employees on the payroll, even if they had to shut the business. Businesses that did that used, I think, 85% of the money they got from the PPP would be forgiven those loans. They wouldn't have to pay them back at all. One of our daughters-in-law has a business, and she took advantage of that and hasn't had to use the money at all. In addition, the federal government issued $1,200 per month for 6 months. I'm sorry, a one-time payment to everyone who earned less than $75,000 per year. In addition, Congress arranged for those who were on unemployment to receive an additional $600 per week in addition to their state unemployment benefits. That program ended on August 1st. There was a moratorium. That means a delay, a stop on evictions and foreclosures from real property, from an apartment or from a house payment. And there was a moratorium on interest on student loan payments till August 1st. The total value of these relief programs was $3 trillion. That is about 1/7 of the total GDP, annual GDP of the United States. The Federal Reserve engaged in quantitative easing, which I'll talk about if you want to know, but they did a good job too. These were great responses, but Congress has been trying to do a 5th major relief act, and they haven't been able to do so. Now I'm gonna let you take a breath and I hope enjoy this slide. I've been talking about a lot of facts and figures and talking in a foreign language, and I know that must be hard for you, but I enjoy this cartoon, and I hope you do too. Anyway, back to work. I want to turn my attention, and I've just got maybe 8 more slides. I want to turn my attention to some legal issues raised by COVID-19 and say a word about how I think we ought to think about them. The coronavirus appeared so dramatically and caused such a remarkable disruption in the United States economy that the states and the federal government were put in the position of activating procedures for having emergency powers. Consider the state governors. The governors are the highest officials in each of our states. Every one of those states has an emergency power statute that allows the governor to do things without getting approval from the legislature in his or her state. Why do we have such powers? Because there may not be time to debate these things. There has to be an emergency powers thing to take care of just the sort of situation that we face. But there were questions that arose. Simply urging people to maintain social distance of 2 meters or 6 feet, or wearing masks in public, simply urging them to do that might not work. As we saw, it didn't work. In some parts of the United States, the rugged individualism that stands us in such good stead most of the time ran up against this public policy or public health practice, and people said, you can't tell me what to do. Well, that was part of the purpose of having the emergency powers, was that there wasn't time to debate these things, and the governors had to tell people what to do, and the people didn't like it. Some people didn't like it. Most people complied with them. But how far did this power go? Could the governors compel businesses to close? Was that a taking? Could they tell churches that they could not meet? Could the governors ban groups of more than 10 meeting? And if they could, for how long? Do they do this just for 30 days and then have to be renewed by the legislature? All of those are big public health problems, and each one of them is what economists refer to as an externality. They're difficult issues. One of the difficulties that plagued us, not just with regard to emergency powers, but a very difficult problem was that it turns out that between 1/3 and 1/2 of all transmissions of the coronavirus between people occur between asymptomatic people. That is, people who don't have symptoms. You know, if you see somebody sneezing and coughing and wiping their nose like this, you know you should stay away. But most of, up to a half of the transmissions were occurring with people that didn't show any symptoms. And we also found we had problems, as you may too, in engaging in what is known as contact tracing, finding out who's got the disease and contacting them and asking them to quarantine. The University of Illinois, where I am now, has created an app for phones that, with the consent of the phone owner, can track who you've been around since you last took a coronavirus test, and has been used to great effect to tell people what that they have been near somebody who's positive for the disease. I'm going to let you read these later. The emergency powers were used by some states, but not by others. There was movement among the states, and that made it difficult to get a handle on the coronavirus. And some states, for example, the southern states that rely on tourism, didn't want to have difficulty by closing businesses when there were a lot of people who were going to come to the southern states in the spring for vacations. The result of this patchwork response of state policies was that it was very, very difficult to get the new virus transmissions down to a level of 10 new cases per 100,000 population. In July, the number of new cases per day rose to 70,000, much higher than it had been in April and May. It's now falling. It's down to about 35,000 new cases per day. And I'll let you look at this slide when you've got more time on your hands. What this slide shows, and I think you'll be able to determine this when you look at it, is that the states that opened quickly, that is, they didn't maintain the lockdown for a long period, the states that opened quickly, that are on the right-hand side of this picture, had higher new cases per million people than the states on the left-hand side that opened slowly or after long periods. Okay. There are other questions under emergency powers. Should we fine people for failing to wear a mask? Should we fine people, or in other ways punish them, if they don't isolate themselves after receiving a positive test for COVID-19, and so on and so forth? I'll let you look at those later. There are lots of interesting issues in these cases. Here's one issue I want to talk about, because it's an issue that is causing lots of problems today. Remember, I said that Congress is considering a fifth relief bill, and that fifth relief bill, now that Congress is back in session, we had hopes that they would do something. They haven't done anything. And it increasingly appears to be the case that they're not going to do anything to distribute money or to reinstate the $600 per week unemployment benefit. And part of the reason is that the Republicans, their principal interest in having a fifth bill is to pass a waiver of liability for businesses. The CARES Act included a waiver of liability for COVID-19 related suits against healthcare providers, which I think is a very good idea. That is, doctors, nurses, hospitals were given a waiver of liability so that they would treat people and treat them in a safe and effective manner. The Republican position for insisting on a wider waiver of liability for all businesses and all employers is that this will help businesses reopen. If businesses have these waivers, they'll reopen when and follow guidelines for only allowing a certain number of people into their stores or a certain number of employees and to be near each other. The Republican position also had a heightened burden of proof for bringing liability suits and removal to federal courts away from state courts so as to minimize what's called home cooking. The Democratic position is that the tort liability system works just fine. We do not need to excuse businesses, consumer businesses, and employers from liability. In fact, if we maintain liability, we'll make sure that businesses and employers take all of the care that they ought to take. I think there's something to be said for an alternative, a safe harbor provision. That is, if a business or an employer follows prevailing guidelines and somebody gets sick in their place of business, but they have followed prevailing guidelines established by the Centers for Disease and Prevention Centers for Control of Prevention and Disease, the CDC, I think they ought to be given a waiver of liability. I think that's probably a good idea. Just a couple of more slides and then I'll be done. There are some private law issues arising from the pandemic that we don't really know much about what's going to happen here. Think about the problems with contract law. A lot of relationships have been disrupted by the pandemic, and it may be impossible or impracticable for one or both contractual parties to perform the business promise that they have made. It could be that one of the parties can seek to be excused from performance by citing frustration of purpose. And the more common clause that's in many contracts is a so-called force majeure clause. That means major force, usually an act of God, something that makes it impossible to perform, an earthquake, a hurricane, a pandemic. We know that American courts are reluctant to excuse performance on any of these grounds. They think foreseeability is pretty a human trait that is used pretty widely. And the reason we're not sure what will happen in many of these disruptions of contract cases in which one of the parties is citing the pandemic as a reason for not performing is that most of the American courts are closed. They closed in March and they haven't reopened yet. I was called for jury duty last month. And I called the county clerk and said, I'm not coming. I don't want to be around other people who might have this disease. And they said, well, we're hearing a lot of that and we think we probably won't start up the courts again. There are other issues in the business acquisition market, as those of you who practice in the business associations know of a material adverse change or material adverse event clause. These are typically used when one business is buying another, and the MAC or MAE clause allows the buyer to step back and say, look, the value that I anticipated is not there. Voting, I'll say much more about this in the question and answer period if you'd like, but voting in the United States is likely to be a mess. And that's partly because in-person voting could be unsafe. Poll workers tend to be 60 years and above, and they are particularly vulnerable to the disease. And most of them don't want to make themselves available to check ballots at the polling stations. So there may be many fewer polling places than there used to be. For example, to give you an example, in the Wisconsin primary, Wisconsin is the state just north of us, in the Wisconsin primary, which was held in May, I'm sorry, in April, the city of Milwaukee, which is the largest city in Wisconsin, has a population of about 500,000. Normally, there are 180 places called polling stations where you can go to vote. But because of the coronavirus, there are only five instead of 180. And as a result, people had to wait in line for 8 hours to exercise their franchise, to vote. We have alternatives, mail-in voting and absentee voting. And as you probably know, the president is doing everything in his power to make mail-in voting and absentee voting difficult, if not impossible. I'd be happy to say more about that later. There are some behavioral considerations that are important here. I think these won't be of any surprise to you. People are generally not very good at assessing risk. And they're particularly not good about assessing the risk of something they cannot see. Remember, the coronavirus is 1,000 times smaller than a bacterium and a cancer cell. And unless you've had somebody in your family who's had it, or you've had it, or somebody you know has had this disease or died from the disease, you might not take it as seriously as you should. There's a famous behavioral problem called the availability heuristic, which suggests that people tend to use readily available information rather than actual, objectively verifiable information in making decisions. A very common example of this is to ask students, what's more common, suicide or murder? We know there are 15,000 murders a year, roughly, in the United States. And most people say murder is much more common than suicide. That's not true. Suicide is almost 3 times more common. There are almost 50,000 suicides in the United States every year, but those aren't publicized. But murder is. Murder is publicized in every form of media that we have. People tend to be over-optimistic, and people tend to follow the confirmation bias. They listen intently to information that confirms their prior beliefs. And that has effects on the spread of the coronavirus. I've talked too much. I've said what I want to say. We're living in the greatest health crisis of the last 100 years. The pandemic has raised some economic and legal issues with which we've never had to deal before. And I hope I've persuaded you that law and economics can help us deal with those legal issues. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And I went over a little longer than I intended, but I hope you'll forgive me. Thanks very much.
Tom, thank you so much for that great presentation. And thank you again for your words about our law school. We are very proud to have you as our dear friend. Oh. We have some questions. I have many.
Sure.
I'm going to read one from my colleague Hernan Gulco, who is a constitutional scholar. Hernan asked about the power to restrict interstate travel.
Yeah.
You mentioned that states have no power to restrict interstate travel, but federal Congress can do that. So the question from Hernan is, where do you find emergency powers used by governors in this? Is that in state constitutions?
In some cases, it's in state constitutions, but in both the federal and state, the power to exercise emergency powers is typically statutory. And as you can imagine, it's something that's done with some fear, because you know, this is how Adolf Hitler came to power, is exercising emergency powers that he was given under the Weimar Constitution. And I think American legislators exercising what I believe are the reasonable beliefs of the American people are reluctant to give their government power to do too many things for too long. In Illinois, there's been a bit of a controversy about whether the governor has a power to do the things that he has done for more than 30 days. But in our case, the legislature is controlled by the Democrats. The governor is a Democrat. And so the Democratic legislature has approved a sort of rolling continuation of the emergency powers. One thing about the question about interstate commerce, interstate travel, since the 1830s or 1840s, the United States Supreme Court has held that restrictions on interstate movement of people, goods is a different thing, but restrictions on interstate movement of people is unconstitutional. Some states on the eastern seaboard tried to enter into an interstate compact that would prevent interstate travel among those states. That didn't work very well. Congress would not approve it, and they were unable to do that very effectively. By contrast, Australia doesn't have this problem. And so the states in Australia could prevent people from other states coming into any given state. And they use that very effectively to get the number of new cases reduced considerably.
So Tom, there's a question from Julieta Cardinali, who is also a visiting professor at our law school and at our master's in law and economics. And the question is, with regards or with respect to behavioral considerations, she asks, isn't it the case that we can see the public officials even more biased than the public, or biased in a more dangerous ways, failing to assess probabilities accurately, over-optimistic, and so on?
That's a good question. It's difficult for me to disentangle the behavioral miscalculations that public officials may make versus their political calculations. I suspect that most of the politicians of whom I'm aware, well, that's not true. Many of the politicians of whom I'm aware were behaving in the way they did because public health officials made a compelling case to them to do the things they did. I think the state governors and state legislatures and the national level who did not make wise decisions, it's possible they were making those unwise decisions because of over-optimism or some other bias, like confirmation bias. But I strongly suspect that they were doing so largely because they didn't want to pay attention to the public health, to what the public health officials were telling them. Public health officials were telling them to do things that they weren't, for political reasons, weren't particularly crazy about doing. But to illustrate Juliana's point, which I think is a good one, the president in particular has had a habit of surrounding himself with people who say what he wants to hear. He has stacked the coronavirus task force with some crazy people. I mean, literally. There are people who say that you should drink Clorox bleach in order to get rid of the virus. By the way, 3 people in New Mexico did that and died. And other people have been treated in emergency rooms for following the president's suggestion that they take injections of Clorox bleach. Clorox is a brand name here. So I think she's a good question, and it's good to ask. But as I say, I can't distinguish between behavioral considerations and misguided political things. Misguided in my view, maybe not in theirs.
Thank you, Tom. So I should say that Julieta Cardinale is a visiting professor from the National University of Singapore.
Oh,
There's a question from our founding dean, Horacio Spector, whom you know very well.
hi,
And
Horacio.
Horacio asked, do you think that a Democrat president would have ordered a national lockdown?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Here's what I think would be the case, and what we may find later this year or early next year. I think, but let me be careful about what I say. I think a Democratic president would have behaved differently, and I think there are a lot of very sensible Republicans who would have behaved differently also. 26 of the states are governed by Republicans, and many of those governors, those Republican governors, followed the public health recommendations of their state public health officials. You wouldn't know this name, but the governor of Ohio, which is a very important state in our political system, the governor, his name is Mike DeWine. He did everything the public health people suggested, and it caused some dissent in his party, but he weathered that dissent. And he's a wonderfully admirable guy for doing that. I think that what a Democrat would have done, Horacio, is to pay attention, much more attention, to the advice of public health professionals, epidemiologists like Anthony Fauci, who were telling him exactly what was going to happen. Fauci made predictions beginning in February that have turned out to be exactly right in almost every case. And I think a Democrat or a more traditional Republican would have followed those public health recommendations more closely. Whether they would have gone as far as to have a national lockdown, I'm not sure. It is quite clear that there are a lot of people in the United States who were very, very deeply bothered by being told what to do. There are a lot of small businesses that have gone out of business and we'll never see them again. And that's a tragedy because there are probably a lot of people who saved and worked hard to start their own businesses, and through no fault of their own, they've lost it. I'm not sure. Good question.
Thank you, Tom. So I'll make two questions. One is about mandatory vaccination, or how to think of vaccination in the US context, assuming that the US will get enough, or will get the possibility to get most people or many people access to the vaccines. How can we think of that from the law and economics perspective? Some people have argued, well, we should not make this mandatory, well, we can pay people to get vaccinated or something like that. And the other one about something that you suggested in one of the slides, having to do with businesses saying, well, this my duty to protect others, the losses that I'm gonna have is somehow some way of taking. It's a taking. So how were you thinking of that, or how is that an argument that came about in the legal discussion in the US? Thank you.
Those are good questions, and there's a great deal of consternation about the first of those, Martine. What to do about vaccinations? here's the sad news about that. There have already been many surveys of randomly selected and stratified selecting, that is by age, stratified pools of people have been asked, if there's a safe and effective vaccine, how likely are you to get it? The percentage of people that say that they are willing to get a vaccine that's safe and effective, that's a very important qualifier, is between 35 and 50%. In order for us to have the benefits of vaccine, and let me be clear, a vaccine, of course, has benefits to the person who gets vaccinated, but it also has benefits to other people because those other people are getting the benefit of not being infected by the person who's vaccinated. In the past, when we've had situations like that, like flu vaccines, the government has subsidized the cost of vaccines so that more people will get vaccinated and therefore provide the public benefit of not being a vector to transmit the disease. The general belief is that 65% of any population has to be vaccinated in order for the public benefit of to other people who are not vaccinated to be great at its maximum value. And we know in these responses to the surveys that only 35 to 50% say they're going to get vaccinated. And we know, for example, that among certain groups within the population, for example, African Americans say only 20, they say that they are only 20% likely to get vaccinated. And that raises the problem you just alluded to. People are going to have to be somehow encouraged to get a vaccine. I saw a discussion recently about whether Congress has the power to mandate vaccinations. And the author who wrote that, a former colleague of mine named Dan Farber, made a pretty persuasive case that Congress does not have the power under the Commerce Clause to compel people to get vaccinated. Can a state compel the people in the state to get vaccinated? I don't know the answer to that. But as a matter of politics, I suspect that that's a very heavy lift. That trying to persuade a bunch of legislators of any party to mandate that people get vaccines is going to run into some very, very strong political headwinds. Could you do something like mandate that every child under the age of 18 get vaccinated? I don't know. I suspect, and there's been some writing about this. I suspect that. Let me refer you to an article by Robert Litan, Litan, that I think he published in the Brookings Review, talking about the possibilities of paying people to get vaccinated and paying them a lot of money, $1,000 to get vaccinated. It'd be interesting to do some testing to see if that's what it would take to get people to do what they otherwise would not do because of this social benefit that we all get from being in a population that's been vaccinated. One last thing about this. I think that's, forgive me for making this bold political statement, but the fact that the president has lied, according to the Washington Post, or made misleading statements 20,000 times in the last 3.5 years. If he announces in late October that there is a vaccine, there are a lot of people, including me, who are going are going to discount what he says because it looks like a politically motivated act. So I guess the point I'm making is we're going to have to overcome this reluctance that people have to get vaccinated in some sort of way. And I don't, money is fine. I wish people would respond to the moral imperative to get vaccinated. The personal one may not be strong enough. And I'm sorry that the president has squandered his ability to influence people to do things by the ease and frequency with which he doesn't tell the truth. There was another part of this question I'm afraid I've missed. What did I miss, Martine?
Yeah, the other one was about business and takings.
Yes. I'd be much more generous towards businesses than I think this Congress is likely to be. I think we're going to have a horrible economic situation on our hands for the next 10 years, maybe. I don't think this is going to be a rapid recovery. And if I'm wrong, we could structure an aid program to businesses that have gone out of business because of the pandemic or that are suffering because of the pandemic. We could structure a program to pull back the benefits if the economy rises or unemployment falls. And we could have stages of this sort of thing. But I mentioned foreseeability when I was talking about contracts. I think a business's ability to foresee the sort of thing we've been through in the last 6 months is extraordinarily limited. And I'm told that the sort of market protections that people might have had, for example, business interruption insurance. In fact, I was talking to a neighbor about that recently. He's in business, and I asked him if his business had business interruption insurance. And he said, no, we don't. He said, we've thought about it. But it turns out there was an article in the New York Times recently that suggested that business interruption insurance will not pay off for loss of revenues because of the pandemic. My suspicion is that insurance companies themselves are going to be extraordinarily hard pressed to get through this pandemic in good financial shape. And although I understand the United States national debt has exploded, I think there are arguments to be made for being extraordinarily generous in an effort to get people more comfortable back to work and businesses back on their feet. And I don't know what program would work, but I think we ought to consider doing that. Takings, whether we should consider what the government did as a taking, that sounds like a stretch to me, but it's possible. You know, if the government tells you to burn down your building to stop a spread of a fire, you're entitled to compensation. So the analogy to close your business to help us get control of the pandemic sounds like a taking. So maybe those arguments will resurface.
Thank you, Tom. So one question from Alejo Gascon. The question is, do you expect an increase in debt restructuring or on government plans to intervene in the economy to help affected industries?
I do. It's a good question, and I do expect something like that. I'm not sure there'll be debt restructuring unless that's part of a program for helping businesses get back on their feet. But I think I'm surprised that the Congress has been reluctant to issue a fifth pandemic relief bill. Partly, well, largely because there's an election coming up, and if you want people to vote against the party that's seen to be preventing generous benefits, that doesn't sound like good politics to me. But the Republicans are in the Senate, they control the Senate, have been reluctant to do another relief bill. And why? Part of their concern is part of what Alejo is saying, that we just learned this week that the size of the national debt has, for the first time since World War II, risen to the level of the gross domestic product. They're both about $22 trillion. You know, the Republicans in the last 3 years really followed a Democratic strategy of using national debt to accomplish the things they wanted to accomplish. And I don't want to get into a discussion about whether the national debt is a bad thing or a good thing. I will tell you that the principal criterion for deciding whether the national debt is too large or too small, and there's not a good criterion for that, has to do with the percentage of the federal budget that is devoted to servicing the national debt. 40 years ago, that percentage was about 3%. And in the 90s and early parts of the 2000s, for various reasons, it rose to about 5% of the federal budget. It's now at 8.7% of the federal budget. At what point does that servicing, paying the interest payments on the national debt, become so burdensome that you can't do other things that you have to do? I don't think 8%, 8.7% is it, but I must admit that the fact that it's getting close to 10% makes me a little bit nervous. Let me say this one last thing about the national debt. Our children and grandchildren are not going to have to pay it back. We would anticipate that future generations will simply roll over the national debt. That is, sell new debt to replace the old debt, pay off what they can, but just roll over the debt. So the principal thing to worry about is the cost of servicing the debt, not so much its size. With regard, one last thing about the government's intervening to somehow finance affected industries. I hope they do. I really do hope they do, because I think the cost, the long-term cost of this economic aspect of the coronavirus pandemic could last 10 years. You know, after the Great Depression, which began in 1929, the gross domestic product did not regain what it had been in 1929 until 1937. So there was 8 years of just trying to get back to where you had been before. And we, as I mentioned, we've lost 5 years of growth just in the last 4 months, 6 months. And that's a real drag on the economy. And that concerns me more than servicing the national debt. So I'm very hopeful that Congress will pull itself together and continue the marvelous, and I really think they were marvelous things that they did in March to try to ease the pain.
Thank you, Tom. I'll make two more, maybe to start ending. One is on the waiver of liability that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And my question is about something that concerns us, which is universities.
Yeah.
How are universities in the US working with this crisis? And is there a waiver of liability, or how are universities thinking of this issue? And the other one is, maybe you can tell us more about your views on what's going on with, or what's going to happen with voting that you mentioned in your presentation.
Yeah. Those are great questions. I don't think Well, let me back up. Everybody I know in the universities, in the university system, and in the elementary and high schools, recognizes that having the students back and in a person-to-person or class-to-teacher relationship is the best way to go about education. That things like this, speaking on Zoom, are a substitute, maybe in some cases a close substitute, but it doesn't really allow for the sort of back and forth through which students learn so much, because somebody asks a question of the professor that causes the professor to correct him or herself, and that's better. So I think every university that I know of, Harvard is an exception, thought that they would try to have students come back. I don't think, Martine, that anybody, I don't think that our university, I'm aware of no university that said to the students returning in person, you have to sign this waiver of liability before we'll allow you to come back. Rather, I think what universities have done is try to minimize the transmission of coronavirus among the students by policies that they apply to the students who've come back. And I think the University of Illinois, I know this to be the case, the University of Illinois' policies have been a model for the United States. There is, to our knowledge, only one other university that has adopted the same program that we have. And what the elements of that program, as I mentioned before, are you have to have a test twice a week. It's a test that was developed at the University of Illinois. So, and it's very inexpensive. It costs $5 to $10 per person to do. And you have to have an app on your cell phone that you can show whenever you go into a building that says that building access has been granted. And if you haven't been tested recently and haven't received a negative indication, building access will be denied. If you get a positive test, by you, I mean students, staff, faculty, you get a call from the public health department, and they provide for the students, they provide a dormitory, a special dormitory, and a hotel that has been taken over for housing and feeding the students who have tested positive. We have about 1,000 students who have tested positive. I don't know what the true positive figure is among those, but we think the test is about 80% effective. We're not sure about that. But the students have to isolate if they're positive for 2 weeks. They can still do their classes online. All classes are online. Some of them are both online and in person. But at the law school, for example, we're doing all online classes. And we're going to stop the school year at Thanksgiving, which is the 4th Thursday in November. And the reason for stopping it then is that most students will go home for that week. And we don't want them going home and then coming back because we have no control of where they've gone and who they've been with. So I think the university has taken steps in an effort to minimize their exposure to liability, but without asking for a waiver of liability from anybody. And I think what the University of Illinois has tried to do is probably really a very good plan. I'll be happy to answer follow-up questions, but let me say a word about voting. One of the good things that's happened in the United States in the last 6 months is that because we are having national elections this fall, almost all the states and the territories had primary elections between February and June or July, so that citizens in the different states and territories and the District of Columbia could express how they felt about the various candidates. Because that was in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, the states that were holding primaries had to develop some policies to deal with the fact that people were nervous about showing up in person without masks and the like. And the biggest problem we found was that the older people who very normally staff the polling stations were very reluctant to do so because of their fears of being infected, with the result that there were very few in-person polling places that were open, and people had to wait hours and hours and hours to vote. In most cases they did, but I don't think anybody was happy about that situation. There is an alternative to in-person voting, and it's called mail-in voting or absentee balloting. There are 5 states in the United States. I think it's Oregon, Colorado, Washington, Hawaii, and one other state I can't remember. They're all in the West. There are 5 states that have almost exclusively mail-in voting. You do not have to ask for a ballot. If you are a registered voter, the state will send you a ballot. The ballot has a computer chip in it that has got your signature, I'm sorry, the first thing they do is send you an application to get a mail-in ballot. You click off a few things and sign it and date it, and then you send it back in a postage paid envelope. The state then prepares, if you want a ballot to be sent to you, a ballot with a computer chip in it that contains your signature, and you vote whenever you want. Some states have already started voting in that fashion. And what the authorities at who count the ballots do is take in your ballot that you've submitted. They put it in a machine to make sure it's legitimate. That machine compares your signature with the signature on the application and on the ballot. And if they're okay, it automatically counts the ballot. And as I say, 5 states, at least 3 of them, sort of majority Republican states, Utah was the other state. Those 5 states do almost exclusively mail-in voting, and they report that they have had almost no, I think it's 0.001% fraud in the course of the last almost 20 years. So the mail-in thing works fine. And we've gone to that in Illinois. Every registered voter has received an application for a mail-in ballot. In some states, 26 of the states, if you don't want to vote in person, you have to ask for an absentee ballot. And in the vast majority of states, when you ask for an absentee ballot, you do not have to provide a reason for why you want the absentee ballot. So it's very much like mail-in voting, except for the fact that you, the voter, have to ask for it. In the mail-in voting states, the state is the one that sends out the ballots to everybody and applications, and you have to fill in the application. Those states, the 26 states that have absentee ballots, are called no excuses. That is, you don't have to give an excuse for why you're not going to vote in person. But there are about 16 states, I think, that have absentee ballots, but they have a very limited number of excuses that they will accept for not voting in person. You have to be on military duty away from the state. you have to be on a business trip away from the state, you have to be disabled, or it's a limited number of things. You can't vote absentee ballot if you just don't want to show up in person. It has to be more than that. The system seems to work very well, both for absentee ballots and for mail-in ballots. And the anticipation is that between 60 and 70% of the voters, and we're talking about 180 million people, 60 to 70% of them are going to exercise the franchise, their vote, by sending in a mail-in ballot or an absentee ballot. And the worry is that that's going to overwhelm both the postal system and the people who are empowered to vote, to count the votes. They may not be able to tell us what's happened on November 3rd. It may take weeks for them to count these absentee and mail-in votes. That's a cause for concern. But all that having been said, let me make two final comments, then I'll quit talking. The president is doing everything in his power to make us believe that mail-in voting is subject to fraud, that it's going to be horrible, and that he is not prepared to accept the results of the vote if a lot of people send in mail-in ballots. I have no idea why he says things like this. To give you another example, early in the COVID epidemic, there was a shortage of what's called PPE, personal protective equipment, which doctors and nurses and other hospital healthcare workers used and needed. For example, masks were in very short supply. And instead of using the powers that he was given by Congress, or that statute gave him in what's called the Defense Production Act, instead of that, the president accused doctors and nurses and healthcare workers of taking those materials out the back door of hospitals to hoard them or sell them. There was no evidence whatsoever that was the case, but the facts don't seem to bother him, or he seems not to be bothered by the facts, whatever those might be, and saying what he wants to say. So his attempts to discredit mail-in voting and absentee voting, and he empowered the Postmaster General to close a lot of mailboxes and to get rid of sorting machines as a money-saving venture, which may have, that made it was more difficult for the postal system to do that. This has caused a great deal of concern in the United States. I'm on the board of our local library, and I read an article in the New York Times a couple of days ago that pointed out that local libraries are one of the institutions in our society that have the highest approval rating among all institutions. And that the author of this article was suggesting that libraries get involved in collecting ballots, that the officials put secure boxes in libraries so that people could put their ballots in there rather than trusting the Postal Service, the government office, to deliver the things. So I immediately called the director of our library and said to her, could we do something like this? And she said, we're already doing it. We've talked to the county clerk. The county clerk's going to give us a box, one in the parking lot that will be available 24 hours and will be secured and guarded, and one inside the library that will be accessible but secure during the hours the library is open. So people are developing some of these alternatives to relying on the Postal Service. I don't know what's going to happen. I fear it's going to be a little bit messy, but the good news is we had to deal with this during most of the primaries and seemed to do a pretty good job of that. But we'll see. The national election is a much bigger deal.
All right, we should probably be finishing. Let me just mention that to the audience that our next seminar in this series of law, economics, and regulation will be taught by Professor Julieta Cardinali from the National University of Singapore on reasons to obey the law. And Tom, let me thank you once again for your generosity and for a wonderful talk and presentation. So thanks a lot. Of course, we hope to see you again personally at Buenos Aires at our campus.
I hope so too. And thank you so much, everybody, for listening. And thank you, Martine, for the invitation. And thank Leila.
No, our pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll see you in the next workshop series.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, Tom. Thank you very much.